George Harrison was always known as the quiet Beatle. While John Lennon captivated audiences with his sharp wit and rebellious personality, and Paul McCartney charmed the world with his melodic genius and natural showmanship, George often remained in the background. Fans saw him as calm, thoughtful, and deeply spiritual, a man who seemed far removed from the conflicts that often surrounded the world's most famous band. But appearances can be deceiving. Behind George Harrison's peaceful image was a man who carried years of frustration. As the Beatles reached unimaginable heights of fame, George quietly fought battles that rarely made headlines. He struggled to earn recognition for his songwriting, watched his ideas pushed aside during recording sessions, and often found himself living in the enormous shadow cast by Lennon and McCartney. For decades, countless fans believed the greatest rivalry within the Beatles was between John Lennon and Paul McCartney. Their creative competition became legendary, inspiring some of the greatest music ever recorded. Yet hidden beneath that famous partnership was another conflict, one that slowly grew over years until it fundamentally changed George Harrison's relationships with those closest to him. Who was the person George Harrison truly resented? Was it Paul McCartney, whose perfectionism often dominated studio sessions? Was it John Lennon, whose sharp tongue and dismissive attitude could leave lasting emotional wounds? Or was the truth far more complicated than fans have imagined? Today we're exploring one of the most fascinating and misunderstood relationships in Beatles history. A story of friendship, admiration, jealousy, artistic growth, and lingering resentment that stretched across decades. To understand how these tensions developed, we have to return to the very beginning. George Harrison entered the world on February 25, 1943, in Liverpool, England. He was the youngest of 4 children born to Harold and Louise Harrison. The family lived in modest circumstances at 12 Arnold Grove, a small terraced house in Wavertree that reflected the working-class reality of post-war Britain. Life wasn't luxurious. The house had no indoor bathroom. Heating came from a single coal fire, and the family shared limited space. Yet despite these challenges, George's childhood was filled with warmth and encouragement. His father worked as a bus conductor after spending time as a ship's steward, while his mother Louise worked in retail. More importantly, Louise possessed an enormous love for music. According to biographers, she often sang around the house with such enthusiasm that neighbors could hear her voice echoing through the walls. She believed music brought happiness, and she encouraged her children to embrace it whenever possible. One story has become particularly famous over the years. During her pregnancy with George, Louise regularly listened to broadcasts featuring Indian music. The hypnotic sounds of sitars and tablas fascinated her, and she believed the peaceful melodies might somehow influence the child she was carrying. Whether or not that story shaped George's future is impossible to prove, but it's certainly remarkable considering how deeply Indian music and spirituality would eventually define both his life and career. When George was still young, the Harrison family moved to a council house in Speke, giving them slightly better living conditions. It was there that his fascination with music truly began to blossom. At Dovedale Primary School and later Liverpool Institute High School, George wasn't known as the most dedicated student. Instead, he spent much of his time thinking about guitars, rock and roll, and the musicians who inspired him. His musical tastes were remarkably diverse. He admired George Formby, Django Reinhardt, Cab Calloway, Carl Perkins, Lonnie Donegan, and several American rock pioneers. But one particular moment changed everything. In early 1956, while riding his bicycle through Liverpool, George heard Elvis Presley's Heartbreak Hotel playing from a nearby house. The song stopped him in his tracks. Later, George admitted that hearing Elvis completely transformed his outlook. Suddenly, music wasn't just entertainment. It became an obsession. From that moment forward, he wanted only one thing: a guitar. Money was tight, but George's mother understood how much the instrument meant to him. Around the age of 14, she purchased a used guitar for just over £3 after a friend offered to sell it. It wasn't a glamorous instrument. It wasn't expensive, but to George Harrison, it represented an entirely new future. A family friend taught him several basic songs, helping him master simple chords and finger placement. George practiced constantly, spending every spare moment improving his technique. His dedication quickly became obvious. Soon he was forming skiffle groups with neighborhood friends and performing whenever the opportunity arose. Around this same time, fate introduced George to another young musician whose life would become permanently intertwined with his own, Paul McCartney. The two boys attended Liverpool Institute and frequently rode the same school bus. Music quickly became the foundation of their friendship. They traded guitar tips. They learned new chords together. They admired the same American rock records. Long before Beatlemania existed, George and Paul were simply two teenagers dreaming about making music together. That friendship would eventually change the history of popular music. In March 1958, Paul believed George possessed enough talent to join another local group called the Quarrymen. The band was led by an older teenager named John Lennon. Initially, John wasn't convinced. George had only recently turned 15, and Lennon thought he looked far too young. But Paul insisted that George deserved another chance. During an informal audition aboard a Liverpool bus, George played the instrumental guitar piece, Raunchy, with impressive confidence and technical skill. John couldn't deny what he'd just witnessed. Despite his age, George was an exceptional guitarist. Soon afterward, he officially joined the Quarrymen, completing a partnership that would evolve into the Beatles. Even then, George developed the quiet reputation that would follow him throughout his life. He rarely demanded attention. He wasn't interested in dominating conversations. Instead, he focused almost entirely on improving his guitar playing. After leaving school at 16, George worked briefly as an apprentice electrician while continuing to pursue music whenever possible. Everything changed in 1960. The newly formed Beatles accepted engagements in Hamburg, Germany, performing marathon sets night after night inside crowded clubs. Those exhausting performances became their real education. Instead of playing short local gigs, they were suddenly performing for hours every evening. The relentless schedule sharpened their musicianship, strengthened their chemistry, and transformed them into one of the tightest live bands in Europe. However, George's first Hamburg experience ended unexpectedly. Because he was still underage, German authorities eventually discovered he wasn't legally permitted to work in the clubs. He was deported back to England. Although disappointing, the setback proved temporary. Within a short time, George reunited with the group, and their journey continued. Everything accelerated after manager Brian Epstein entered the picture in late 1961. Epstein polished the band's appearance, encouraged them to replace their leather outfits with tailored suits, and tirelessly pursued recording opportunities. His efforts paid off. The Beatles signed with EMI and released their debut single, Love Me Do. The song became their first chart success. Soon afterward came their debut album, Please Please Me, launching Beatlemania across Britain. As their popularity exploded, each member naturally developed a public identity. John became the outspoken rebel. Paul became the charming romantic. Ringo emerged as the lovable comedian. George became known simply as the Quiet Beatle. The nickname followed him throughout the 1960s, especially after the group's arrival in America in 1964, when George battled illness while preparing for their historic appearance on The Ed Sullivan Show. Because doctors advised him to conserve his voice, reporters noticed how little he spoke compared to the others, reinforcing the image of a reserved, mysterious musician. Yet behind that silence, George was becoming increasingly important to the band's musical evolution. Although Lennon and McCartney remained the principal songwriters, George steadily developed his own creative voice. He sang lead vocals on several early Beatles recordings and eventually contributed his own original composition, Don't Bother Me. It was only the beginning. While John and Paul focused largely on Western rock and pop influences, George constantly searched for fresh musical ideas. He introduced the band to American soul records, explored folk rock influences, and became fascinated by sounds that extended far beyond conventional British pop music. That curiosity would soon lead him toward Indian music, Eastern philosophy, and a completely different artistic direction, one that would forever change both his own career and the sound of the Beatles. As the Beatles evolved from a successful British rock band into a worldwide cultural phenomenon, George Harrison evolved with them. No longer satisfied with simply playing lead guitar, He wanted to contribute ideas that reflected his own artistic vision. While John Lennon and Paul McCartney remained the dominant creative force, George quietly worked to develop a style that was entirely his own. His breakthrough came during the mid-1960s. While many Western musicians were experimenting with folk and psychedelic sounds, George became captivated by Indian classical music. It wasn't simply the unusual instruments that fascinated him. It was the philosophy behind the music. He admired its spirituality, discipline, and emotional depth, believing it offered something that conventional pop music could never fully express. That fascination first became widely apparent when he introduced the sitar into a Beatles recording. The distinctive instrument appeared on Norwegian wood, giving millions of listeners their first exposure to Indian music within a mainstream rock song. It wasn't a gimmick or an attempt to follow trends. George genuinely wanted to learn the traditions behind the instrument, eventually studying under renowned sitar virtuoso Ravi Shankar. His growing interest influenced nearly every aspect of his life. He immersed himself in meditation, Hindu philosophy, and Eastern spirituality, searching for meaning beyond fame and fortune. While Beatlemania continued reaching unimaginable heights, George often seemed less interested in celebrity than in understanding life's deeper questions. His expanding worldview soon found its way into his songwriting. By the time the Beatles recorded Revolver in 1966, George's confidence as a composer had increased dramatically. He opened the album with the biting tax protest song, Taxman, while also contributing Love You Too, a composition deeply rooted in Indian musical traditions. These songs demonstrated that George was no longer simply contributing occasional tracks. He was becoming a serious songwriter. Yet despite his obvious growth, the balance of power inside the Beatles remained largely unchanged. John Lennon and Paul McCartney still dominated the albums. They wrote the majority of the songs. They decided much of the band's musical direction. And although George's talent